As the huge column of ants marched, there was a noticeable air of tension. Millions of antennae and mandibles eagerly and anxiously clicked as the army marched, ready to exact the ants' revenge on the worms. The speed at which this huge force, nearly 2 million ants strong, had been organized and prepared was nothing short of extraordinary. The surprise attack on Anthoria had left such destruction and carnage that any other empire would have taken years to recover before they could even consider retaliation. The ants, ever disciplined and organized, had taken a mere 3 months. The initial worms' surprise attack had brought the city to its knees. So ferocious and sudden had the initial attack been that the city's Ant Garrison Defense Command had completely broken down. All across the city, pockets of ant soldiers mixed with civilian and worker ants had fought in desperate struggles for their lives. Huge ant buildings had crumbled under the sheer weight of the worms' attacks. Within the first 3 hours, nearly 60% of the city had been destroyed, fighting taking place in every street, every alley, and every building as the monstrous worms carved through the city. It was only when a 3 million strong relief column, made up of the combined forces of nearly 10 different nearby cities, settlements, and fortresses arrived, had the ants regained their cohesion and slowly driven the worms from the city. When it was all said and done, nearly 5 million ants, a tenth of the entire empire, had fallen in the city's 6-hour defense, with another million seriously wounded. The worms, on the other hand, with the element of surprise, had fared much better. Only 7,000 of the 25,000 strong element had fallen in battle, the rest managing to withdraw before being overwhelmed by the fresh ant reinforcements. Yet for huge losses the worms had inflicted, they had not succeeded in the Emperor Worm's objective. The city, though devastated, had not completely fallen, and the ants quickly set to work repairing and rebuilding. With the ant army vanguard finally arriving soon after the battle to reinforce the city, there would be no chance for a second worm attack to destroy the city completely. The Empress Ant, her commanders and her advisors, upon hearing of the attack on Anthoria, had immediately enacted emergency measures to bring the empire into full wartime mode. After organizing the relief forces as well as the army vanguard to the city, they began planning for a retaliatory strike. Though severely weakened, the Empress and her commanders had recognized the need to keep the worms busy, while Anthoria rebuilt at least primitive defenses. The ants had begun border skirmishes all along the front with the worms, attacking the least defended and isolated worm tunnels and above-ground settlements. All this in a bid to buy time for a full-scale invasion by the ant armies. The skirmishes, though inflicting no real damage to the worms, had succeeded in their objectives of keeping the worms occupied. Hundreds of thousands of ants attacking hundreds of different worm settlements had caught the worm army off guard. The Emperor Worm and his generals had not expected the ants to be able to respond with such numbers and force so quickly, and thus had to spread their worm soldiers from the Anthoria attack, still exhausted after the battle, thin, in order to repel the border ant attacks while the main worm army began its slow march to the border. The ants, meanwhile, had bought themselves enough time to turn Anthoria back into a hub of military activity, and within 3 months had organized this strike column comprised of the army vanguard and survivors from the Anthoria attack. This column was not just a token of the empire's resilience, but a clear message that the ants would not sue for peace. The ants had studied the worms' tactics, learned from their initial failures, and had prepared accordingly. The Empress Ant had consulted with the Ant War Council, a body of the most seasoned military minds in the empire. They had analyzed the worms' movements, their weaknesses, and had come up with a strategy that was as surprising as it was risky. Their target was not the worm border fortresses, as the Emperor Worm had anticipated. Instead, it was the worm's logistical center, a sprawling network of tunnels and caverns deep within the worm's own territories. It was the beating heart of their war effort, where food and supplies were stored and distributed to the worm front lines. The ants knew that if they could disrupt this lifeline, the worm's ability to wage war would be significantly weakened. The logistical center was well defended, surrounded by layers of worm tunnels that branched out like the veins of a giant creature, each one packed with soldiers ready to repel any invaders. But the ants had a plan. They would not fail. They could not fail. This would be for the Empire. This would be for Anthoria.